Like I said, it's an honor to be with you. I usually start anything that I say or do, Sher Ali, with Musa's dua in the Quran when they were about to meet Pharaoh. Allahumma shrah li sadri, ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. O Creator, open thy breasts and make my affairs easy and undo the knot of my tongue, such that what it is that I have to share with you and ostensibly the audience reaches hearts, ears. The first question that you pose is a very interesting one. I was fired, yes, on C-SPAN, on live television. But what Colombia allowed to happen was to see through my contract ending. So I was fired. That's all right. So as I was saying, I was fired, not fired, because on live television, I was fired. However, Colombia allowed my contract to end. When Manu Shafiq was at the congressional hearings, I was in the midst of the encampment itself, seeing my students get arrested. It was a little bit over a year ago. Obviously it was quite shocking. I'm not somebody that ever sought to be a public figure or publicity for that matter. And the challenge with it is that it delineated my ability to be underground and to do the work that I do and the organizing that I do. Now, I was targeted specifically, in my humble opinion, well, according to the right, not only because I'm condemning Israel, but as Elon Musk, as Pete Hegseth, as Tommy Robinson, as Shai Davidai, as Elise Stefanik, as so many had pointed out, David Rubin, and the alt-right that has recorded 5-6 hour videos on my talks and talks that I've given or lectures that I've given. I was being targeted because I was critiquing settler colonialism in the context of the U.S. The U.S. is the parent of the child Israel. In so many ways, the Nazis and Zionists look to the settler colonial model in the context of the US. And that's the fact. So Palestine, yes, is a state of exception, but it's only a state of exception insofar as if we actually listen to her, not self-imposed narratives of 48, of 1917, that still behold Palestine to a British proctored geography, if you will, that is separated, because traditionally Palestine is, if you will, the dagger that extends the Levant and is an extension of the Levant, the Assyric territory, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. I mean, Syria is not really a state or shouldn't be a state. Jordan isn't really a state. Lebanon isn't really a state. And the North African axis, vis-a-vis Gaza, that acts as a window into Rafah and elsewhere, Sinai and elsewhere. So this is the significance of Palestine. And then to contend with Palestine, then you have to deal, as my work deals with, 1492 and what happened with Muslims and Jews in the context of Andalusia, modern-day Spain, and the settler conquistador mission, crusading mission, because Columbus was a crusader, that commenced really in the Caribbean, and what we call Turtle Island, or more broadly, Abiyala, stretching across North and Latin America in so many ways. So this becomes a conundrum. 1492 unravels how this is a religious war as well as being a racial war. Academia is just academia. It was always an extension of the settler state. You see, the problem isn't the moniker of free speech. There never existed really free speech. There is no American dream. It's always been an American nightmare, as Malcolm had long noted. The question is that a lot of people would like to buy into the fantasy, just as they do with regards to the state, that we can reform the state, that we can revolutionize the state. But the academy is just an extension of the settler state. It's hierarchical, it's patriarchal, it's on stolen land above all. So this becomes the irony. So I have no fantasy, never had a fantasy, whether I was in Cornell University before Columbia. And Cornell is the largest land grab university vis-a-vis the Morrill Act. It seized over 1 million acres of stolen land, indigenous land that stretches all the way to California and Wisconsin and so on and so forth. So the reason that there was a clampdown on Columbia University, or at least the encampment, at Columbia, and I'm very proud of my students, obviously, and I'm very proud to have been a fundamental part of the encampment itself, is because it showed a world where all worlds fit. The possibility of different worlds. My students learned more at the encampment than they did within the classroom, right? How to connect the struggle insofar as Kashmir and settler colonialism in Kashmir and the Rohingya and the situation in Myanmar and so on and so forth, the Uyghurs and so on, all these multiple Sudan, the Congo and so on, the ethnic cleansings, the genocides, simultaneously to what is going on insofar as anti-blackness and anti-indigenous sentiments that act as foundations to U.S. empire, to Canadian empire, to Australia, to New Zealand, and so on. So Colombia is just an extension of the settler state. There is no reforming. The question is, how do I divest from these institutions? That's the interesting part. Right. Just as much as how do you divest from the settler state? Because I dislike it when people say we're going to dismantle. There is no such thing. You're not going to dismantle the military, the pharmaceutical, the agrochemical, the prison to school. That's a fantasy. That's the squat, progressive, liberal, democratic line. Unfortunately. And we could sit down and talk about Mamdani's election within that context, etc. Oh, I believe in in a one-state solution. There is no one-state solution. So all these liberal progressive views, but yeah, that's the academy. And in relationship to my doxing and why my doxing was particularly vicious, amongst the gatekeeping too that is ongoing and that we spoke of on the part of the left. Because what I'm doing is holding a monster or holding a mirror to the big monster and saying, well, as diaspora Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, I'm sorry to say we're Zionists on stolen land. What are we doing and what are we saying with regards to that? How are we sending your indigenous people and the fact that we live on stolen land in our day-to-day lives? Over and beyond empty land acknowledgments of this and that, right? The tokenization of indigenous people ahead and the front of mass mobilizations. And this is where we can get into Kwame Ture and the difference between mobilizations and organizing. Organizing means building alternatives, right? Like the Panthers did, like Zapatistas did. But I'll stop there. Obviously, that there's a lot to unravel.
Yeah. Can you give a little bit more about the doxing itself and the various tactics that have been used in the crackdown of pro-Palestinian voices, the infrastructure, the Zionist infrastructure that has been built in the context of the academy, and how that space has been significantly curtailed since October 7th? The way anti-Semitism has been used as a weapon to target these voices?
Thank you very much for your question. Doxing has been going on for a significant for at least a few decades, if not before. We can look at, attempts with regards to Edward Said, who had to have bulletproof glass, basically installed, I believe, at Columbia, if not his home, because of death threats that he received. But then we have cases as my colleague and somebody who I very much look up to, like Joseph Edo or Stephen Shalaita. So the doxing has been going on for quite some time. Now, in this moment, there is a particular exceptionalization in the nature of the doxing because we have to pay attention to the circumstances of October 7th, of which General Sinwar and the Mujahideen in Gaza have done. Number one, they did nothing. What they did is nothing short of a miracle. They incepted and they put the entire world on one foot. And why? When we look at the reason why, we begin to see that General Sinwar, as well as commanders like the eminent Mohamed Abdou, had recognized, and in speeches going back to 2022, that the desecration of Al-Aqsa and the attempt to wholly make this into a religious war was very much underway. The desecration of Al-Aqsa Mosque, Haram al-Ibrahimi, and so on and so forth. And the general warned. So I'm raising this to say that, sure, there is no doubt about it, Zionist influence within institutions in the US and Canada and elsewhere. But this is a crusader-led war. And the majority of Zionists are actually crusaders. They're crusading Christian Zionists. Mm-hmm. And it becomes very important to understand then, in the context of the religious war, why the clampdown was so vicious. In my case, in other people's cases, in the case of certainly the students as well. Particularly those of us that pointed to this fact. And the more staunch that one was in support of not only an abstract resistance, because what was being held against me is that I wasn't speaking about resistance in the abstract. It was a Facebook post that I wrote shortly after October, within a few days actually, and it clearly stated, I stand with Hamas, I stand with Hezbollah, I stand with Ansar Allah. So I name things for what they are. I don't speak in some kind of abstract resistance. A lot of people do. I prefer, again, nuance. This becomes very important. So again, going back to your question, the degree of, you will often find there's a great deal of confluence between, again, board of directors, board of trustees, with various interests, whether it's the NYPD, in the case of Eric Adams, or when we look at UCLA and the encampment there. The confluence of power, and particularly those who have invested in the world of the above, or what the Zapatistas say, the world of the above, right? Versus the world of the below, the world of the encampments. So I think in so many different ways, again, that's the crux of the equation, and why the events of October and the aftermath of them and the ongoing results of them have led to the situation that we're at, be it on campuses or otherwise, and the attempts of students that continue on up until this moment. And now, sadly, of course, tactics and strategies have to evolve because we have to build upon the encampments, and that is a project that has yet to take place when we talk about the gentrification of Harlem, for instance, and many other contexts as well at the same time. So, yeah.
So can you speak a little bit about the encampments? Because the figure of Mahmoud Khalil and others, which have emerged, especially in this Trump dystopia that has been created, where ICE and all these efforts to sort of silence students has occurred. Can you talk about the inception of the encampments, how they took place, and just the significance of it on on the terrain of the campus?
But I can say that, mashallah, the student intifada that manifested in Colombia was a product of a lot of labor and a lot of strategizing and a lot of tactics. It was not something that emerged overnight. With my students in particular, a fair number who were involved at central to the encampment and who've been doxxed, who've been kicked out of Colombia at this point. I have to say that the students were incredibly courageous. And it came out of the idea that mobilizing is not the same as organizing. For 6 months, if not before, people were engaged in mass protests, which are certainly not as significant as the, say, anti-war protests of Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of numbers. But as the Quran teaches us, وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةٍ كَثِيرَةٍ, how much of a small group defeated a larger enemy. Inshallah, if God wills, and if this group is organized. Now, what does organizing mean? It means incepting alternatives. So that means going beyond, again, the streets. Because street actions are important, direct actions are also important. So Palestine actions are now important. So please don't get me wrong with regards to that. They're also limited because they don't create alternatives. They don't create other worlds. Right? So you may disrupt a Maersk sort of arms supply shipment or factory in one location, but then that doubles sort of the amount of investments in other locations and other factories and so on. So this isn't about even tax monies, because we're talking about tax money. I mean, this argument with regards to, well, we don't want our taxes going to fund Israel. Yes, but the taxes also fund imperialism elsewhere. And imperialism elsewhere rests at settler-colonialism at home. So the encampment served as an opportunity to contest those and to build a narrative, if you will, that interconnects struggles from a racial and a religious perspective. Say, case in Colombia, I believe the encampment lasted 2 weeks. Imagine that we had more time. But this is where, again, the encampment served as an experiment that needed to be transported to neighborhoods. Because, look, the single mother with 3 kids, she may believe in the Palestinian cause. She may be completely down. But at the end, she's going to ask, I'm working 2 to 3 jobs. What are you suggesting for me here? Who is going to take care of my kids? What am I going to do for rent? So in order to organize her, and Malcolm was a great organizer, unlike MLK, who is a great mobilizer, not an organizer though, there needs to be an alternative project. You need to be able to create alternative schools, alternative hospitals. Again, that's what our Muqawma did in Gaza. That's what the Zapatistas did, what the Panthers did in the so-called quote-unquote survival programs, the free breakfast programs, the alternative schools, educations. So the students remind us, because they're youth, of a way of, like I always say, if colonialism stole anything, it's our ability as people of color to dream dangerously. To dream dangerously beyond identitarian politics, because liberal identity politics are also limited. You know, what's BIPOC, right? Because that assumes that there are no indigenous people that are black, that assumes that there are no black people that are indigenous in the context of Egypt, say with the Siwa people, with the case of the Nubians, and so on and so forth, right? And to break out of the molds of identitarian politics, you have black people of color, and so on and so forth. So, and to contest narratives as, you know, and so far as anti-blackness within, you know, Swana, Southwest Asian, North African communities that animate a great deal. I mean, look at the degree of internalized colonialism and resentment when we bleach our skin white, skin bleaching creams in the context of India, for instance, right? So, and to really think, right, like on a global level, on a micro level, right? To think globally as the Zapatistas, my elder sort of Gustavo Esteban, and to act locally, right? How do we connect Kashmir and the autonomy of Kashmir beyond both Pakistani hegemony, beyond Indian hegemony, and so on and so forth? All these dynamics, how do we break through out of nation state discourses? Because the state is not this abstract entity that exists over and above us. We already govern ourselves and one another vis-a-vis the set of capillary relations that we reproduce and asymmetries of power that we internalize from the state that acts as our father every single day. We reproduce prejudices, fascisms every single day. So Trump merely represents, because look, the encampments happened during Genocide Joe's time. But Trump represents a masks off moment, right, for imperial settler-colonial crusading empire. And I think people have yet to come to terms, because we're not talking about a heightened level of fascism. Fascism was always already here since 1492, again, since Columbus's project.
Yeah.
And Columbus wanted to gather riches simply to engage in the reconquest of Jerusalem, of Al-Quds. Okay.
Yeah.
So he just, instead of India, which he headed towards, he ended up landing on the shores of the Caribbean, and we can talk a lot more about that. Trump represents the full-on masks-off moment that was anteceded by Biden. ICE was always a problem. Look at how Democrats, including Uncle Tom Obama, ICE, during his reign, engaged in Gestapo night raids. Over 1 million migrants, immigrants, were deported during his time. So, yeah, if we're really honest and legitimate, right, that is what the encampments were confronting. Dearth of history, that breadth of history, that detail of history. And people are still refusing to wake up. This is the reality that we're contending with, and the need to build alternatives. So the encampments were a microcosm of that. But how do you take that beyond the Ivy League academy and to begin to construct? Why aren't students divesting completely from the academy instead of sensibly? And I understand, of course, the courage chaining themselves to Columbia, because at the same time, it seems like this abusive relationship that one is entangled within and is unable to think beyond. So, of course, I appreciate the valiancy, but then situating the fact that we're on stolen land becomes very critical. In the U.S. context, the original sin of 1492 is constantly erased. The U.S. history usually begins with 1619, the afterlife to slavery projects and slavery in the Middle Passage. And, of course, that's important to address. But what's always camouflaged is 1492 and the fact that we are benefiting and living off of stolen land. So that's constantly decentered. Right? I may not be a Zionist that's holding a gun, but I'm certainly, again, reaping the fruits. So this, again, goes beyond taxes. It goes beyond Colombia. It has to deal with trying to envision a different way of life with indigenous people at the center, because they're not an add-on analysis, right? They need to be centered in our lives, in our analyses. And how do we then build? How do we have professors divest from institutions? How do students divest? What kind of alternatives can we create virtually on the ground according to the models that our ancestors had incepted?
No, thank you for that overview. And I love how you're able to connect it to broader history, historical context. I want to begin with a question about yourself. As a Muslim anarchist and interdisciplinary activist, researcher, scholar, how did this position emerge intellectually, spiritually, and politically in your mind?
Thank you for that. There are many ways that I can answer your question. I guess I can begin it by talking, I could sit down and talk about my upbringing, studies of the Quran, reading Fanon at 14, Malcolm, autobiography, Black Skin, White Masks, Nazar Qabbani, Fatwa Tuqan, Palestinian thinkers, Ghassan Khanafani, and thinking about, and going to mosques and praying, and, the khatib or the person giving the sermon saying, oh, Ya Allah, save Palestine, oh, Ya Allah, save Kashmir, oh, Ya Allah, save Afghanistan. And reflecting on my position in the world, having to leave Egypt at 16 because I wrote an article against the Mubarak regime, amongst the reasons that I had to leave Egypt, or even becoming a settler on stolen land in the context of Canada that acknowledges what happened to indigenous people as quote unquote a cultural genocide, which is a whitewashed way of not dealing with the fact that it's an actual ongoing genocide there.
Yeah.
And living away for 45 minutes from the Mohawk Reserve. I actually started off as an engineer. I studied engineering, but my love and my passion was for always interdisciplinary works: Islamic studies, sociology, queer studies, indigenous studies, Black studies. So that was sort of the trajectory. And my involvement in Palestinian organizing shortly after I arrived on Turtle Island. But then Seattle, 1999, the anti-globalization movements happened. And all it's the confluence of all this spurred further my organizing, I guess. My disillusionment with Muslims and Muslim diasporas, and my involvement in a lot of anarchistic circles. I mean, the irony
Yeah.
about being an anarchist or an anarchist Muslim is, what do these labels even mean
Yeah.
if I believe Islam is inherently anarchistic? But
Yeah.
one deploys these labels as a means of disrupting stereotypical manifestations of who and what is an anarchist versus who and what is a Muslim. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then later Tahrir, and in between that, organizing with Mohawks on Turtle Island, standoffs there in the context of specifically Tantanega, which is the reserve that I lived 45 minutes away from, being a part of, workers' cooperatives that I was a part of, social centers that I was a part of, helped found. All these, like I said, the creation of alternatives. I try not to preach that which I don't inherently practice per se. Or haven't been
can you
involved in. Yeah.